Morning. Let me see if I can get this to, all right. So there's, like Robert noted, there is an interesting atmospheric phenomena on the screen. I think there's some, I don't know how it will evolve. It's some dynamical system, obviously. So I want to welcome you all to this, I think, spectacular event today. I thought that in the program it says that I should introduce the topic, so I thought I'll just tell you in 5 minutes the history of the theory of computing. This will have to be in very large resolution. So, and hopefully I'll steal some thunder from the talks of the speakers, or but only briefly. The first, so the pictures are not here. Very, very interesting. So there's a picture of Turing. So the field was born in 1936. I always like to tell my students that this is a model of PhD work. This is Alan Turing was a PhD student at the time. He wrote this paper, a mathematical paper, in a logic journal with this daunting title. And in this paper, this is, what did he do? So he has a mathematical model of a computer, the Turing machine. And this is a really fantastic demonstration of the power of theory, because the theory of computing existed before the practice of computing. It gave birth to what we all know today as the computer revolution that affects, basically everything we do. I'm not sure whether we are masters or slaves here, but it affects our lives in a way that, I think unprecedented. It contains two other things. It contains the idea that natural processes should be thought of as information processes. So in other words, nature computes. And if nature computes, computers can emulate what nature does, and that became known as the Turing thesis. And the last part is, like my colleague Christos Papadimitriou likes to say, computer science was born aware of its limitations. So unlike physics, which had to discover the uncertainty principle, for example, in computer science, we already knew from day one, from this paper, that not every problem is solvable by computers, not every computational problem. And then the field grew, and lots of techniques and models and algorithms were developed with users everywhere in technology and science. And the next event I want to tell you about is 35 years later, with Cook and Levin introducing this hypothesis that, I see also that there is no room on this slide. Something is weird in the presentation, but we'll recover. The hypothesis that P is different than NP. Now, I'm not going to explain this problem. This is a topic for a separate lecture that I actually gave here. I want to tell you about the nature of this problem. So let me start from the second point. It's a computer science problem. It was invented by people in the theory of computation. It's a question about the power and limits of efficient algorithms. What can we efficiently solve, like, say, in our lifetime? So it's a computer science problem, but it's also a mathematical problem. It's a completely precise mathematical problem. It's either true or false, and we hope to be able to someday prove, one of the other. Most people believe that it's different. In fact, we are tormented by this problem since 1971. And this was a major goal of the field. But then it has other aspects that make it sort of more unique among intellectual problems. It's also a practical problem. It's practical at least in the sense that this hypothesis underlies everything that you guys are doing. All of you are shopping online, for example. So it underlies all internet security and electronic commerce. If P was equal to NP, all of this will collapse immediately. There is no hope for anything like this if P equals NP. So, in some sense, you are betting when you are thinking that what you are doing is secure, that P is different than NP. And finally, if you, like me, take the view that nature computes, this question about what computers can do efficiently is also a question about what nature can do efficiently. And this informs, the construction of scientific models for a variety of natural processes. Because if your model predicts that some process in nature is going to solve problems that are unsolvable by this hypothesis, then, either something is wrong with your model or you solve the major open problem. So this was suggested that until we actually solve this problem of P versus NP, it's better be promoted to a status of a natural law in that, similar to, let's say, the second law of thermodynamics. I think most scientists would hesitate to propose a model that, violates the second law. And I think they should treat similarly the possibility that their model violates the P different than NP hypothesis. So since that work, it turned out that lots of other aspects of computational modeling, computational understanding, figuring out limits and power of various abstract computational devices informs science in lots of different ways. And for this, here are the pictures. Good. So I see that the last part of the picture is not here. So the last part of the picture you'll see for yourself. It's pictures of our 4 speakers. And we are here about 80 years after the field started. We have, I'm grateful to all 4 to agree and to come here and give talks about the impact of computational understanding and these interactions between the theory of computing and the sum of the various sciences. It's just a sample. And these are Les Valiant from Harvard, Tim Raffgarden from Stanford, John Kleinberg from Cornell, and Scott Aronson from MIT. And I'll just move on to introduce the first speaker, Leslie Valiant from Harvard. I made sure that the programs contain not only the abstracts of the talk, but also the bios of the speakers and the website. So I don't have to start and tell you a long list of honors for each one that will take a lot of time. So about Les Valiant, all I can tell you is that he's been a leader of the field for the past 40 years. When I was a graduate student, I was inspired by his papers, and today I still am inspired by his more recent papers. He's been enormously influential and impacted lots of areas within the theory of computing, which again I will not list, but I'll tell you about a contribution of his that's not on his website. He contributed 2 children to the field. His 2 sons are young theoretical computer scientists doing great work. Les wrote 2 books, one called The Circuits of the Mind, a computational view of what's going on in the brain, and one that was just published, probably approximately correct, in which he explained his computational view of the evolution and competition and adaptation in unknown environments. So let me welcome Les Valiant to give the first talk.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this hopefully a wonderful day. So the general theme of the workshop is something which has been very close to my heart for a long time. So we know that the connections of theory of computer science to mathematics and to computer systems, that's kind of traditional. But so this day is about connections with four other areas. And So I'll be talking about its connection with biology, as I understand it, and in particular evolution. So the general title of this workshop is the computational lens on various things. And I should just start by mentioning that so the various connections of computer science to these various areas are probably all different. So one shouldn't assume that they're all the same. And in some cases, I think one can make even stronger claims. So the problem with this computational lens phrase is that it somehow suggests that knowledge is relative. Okay, you can look at everything from different lenses and you see something different. And okay, so that's a very modest claim. Okay, but since it's early in the morning, we can explore a more aggressive claim that maybe some areas of some natural phenomena are really computational, and that's what they are. And that's the primary lens through which you have to view it. And I suppose people who take this view would talk about the computational universe. So you actually say the universe is computational. So we're trying to understand natural phenomena, and we know about physics, we know about mathematics, and the relationship between the two is some sort of mystery, which we're all confused about. And so the main message is that we've got a third thing in the mix about which we'll be even more confused. So the relationship between these things is probably won't be resolved for a very long time, if ever. But the point I do want to make, so I've introduced some of the themes, so I'll just try to clarify them, how I view them, is that I will view computation as a way of understanding natural phenomena, just like physics is a way of exploring natural phenomena, and the connection between the two isn't so clear. So the main idea is that, just like physics, computation has its laws, limitations, how the world is limited. And so the first thing I just want to explain quickly is how do computational laws relate to natural phenomena, in particular biology. So here's a very quick answer to that. So I think one starts with a law, and in computer science, the original law is the Church-Turing thesis, which said that what's mechanically computable are exactly those things that can be computed by a Turing machine. The Turing machine is something with a precise mathematical definition. And as Avi said, once one has a definition, then one can prove something mathematically about this definition. For example, that some functions are not computable. But this is how it works. So there's a mathematical theory, and you can make mathematical deductions, but at the basis of it is some assumption about nature. Okay, so the Church-Turing thesis is an assumption about nature. So the question is, so this is where computer science started. So the question is, how do you use it? Okay, so what if you ask questions like, can the brain be described as a computation? Or can biological reproduction be described as a computation? So one interesting question is, what exactly do these questions mean? So, for example, for Neumann, tried to ask exactly what does this question of biological reproduction mean. It's different from crystal growth. Okay. So it's a substantial intellectual question, what the question is. But my point is that the answer is always clear. The answer to all these questions is yes. Okay. And the answer is yes, because computation is just defined to be so broad that it includes any phenomena in nature which one would think of as computation. So the question of whether these statements, well, the answer is yes, hang on the validity of the Church-Turing thesis. If you believe in the Church-Turing thesis, then the answer to this is always yes. So this rather substantial question about substantive questions about nature, the truth of these have been abstracted to a computational question. Okay, so if the answer to any of these turned out to be no, then that would contradict the Church-Turing thesis that everything which we'd regard as computational, as mechanical can be captured by Turing machines would be wrong. Okay, so I think this is very basically how things work in computer science. And I just want to make a kind of a historical argument for this computational universe viewpoint. And so again, let's start with Alan Turing and John von Neumann, who've been mentioned already. So they were both mathematicians. They worked on, among many things, they worked on things which are very conventional areas in computer science. They designed machines. They analyzed algorithms. They proved program correctness. They did applications. But what I want to emphasize now is that they also went off in a very strange direction. And in particular, so Turing published a book about, paper about intelligence and about morphogenesis, this is biological development, how do living things grow to have certain regularities. And von Neumann studied the brain, and he studied self-reproducing automata. So how come these pure mathematicians in the mid-20th century suddenly went off in this weird direction? I mean, pure mathematicians hadn't done that in previous centuries, and so what was going on? It was very strange. So I think the answer is that clearly they saw what we've been suggesting in the last few minutes, is that there is this possibility of understanding mechanical processes. So science tries to give mechanical explanations of nature, and suddenly there was a definition of what a mechanical process was, and they saw that this gave a new approach to understanding to understanding the world, especially biology. So the idea that computation is a good way of viewing biology became immediately clear, I think, after Turing's original work on defining computation, and maybe became obvious, I think, to quite a few people, besides the originator Turing and von Neumann, who clearly understood it. So the main idea of this computational universe has been around from the beginning of computer science, clearly. So the main question is, how can we make it more useful? And we really want to understand nature. Okay, so how do you answer questions which are traditional questions in, say, biology, using the idea of computation? And many years have elapsed, and so the original law of computation, the Turing thesis, has been used, but its impact has been limited and on say, biology. And the reason is that it's a very general. Okay, so what a general computation which can run for arbitrary amounts of time is just not very constraining. So if we ask what can we do now to further this research program, then I think the obvious direction is that now we have much more information about computation, much more restrictive laws of computation or suggested laws, and these deal with constraints in computation, so quantitative resources used by mechanisms. So the number of steps, the number of components used, and things like that. So this is the study of computational complexity, which is a core of theoretical computer science. It's a kind of substantial field which has been taking decades to develop. It's not the work of one person, and it's not clear whether it's settled down yet. So the talk is really about applying this kind of thinking to draw more specific conclusions about biology than could be drawn just from the Turing thesis. And in particular, I want to discuss this problem of Darwinian evolution. How come this process has come this far, this fast? So the idea that evolution seems to be a process which is mysterious, should take a long time. We don't have an explanation of why it's worked as well as it has in the time believed to be available, and can we view it as a computational process? Okay, so first I'd like to say that this question of questioning quantitative questions about evolution were very important in the 19th century, and in some sense were suppressed in the 20th, but I think we should revisit them. This is kind of a much rehearsed history that Darwin understood that that evolution would be very slow. So in his first edition of his Origin of Species, he noted that some geological formation in his opinion, was at least 300 million years old, suggesting that there was enough time for evolution on Earth. But then the physicists, or some physicists, disputed this. They reckoned from their known physics that Earth should have cooled down to its present temperature in much less time. So this was an intellectual debate of the 19th century, which was never quite resolved, and worried Darwin a lot. So of course the time available physicists have given us has expanded, but there's still no theory of why this amount of time would have been enough for evolving what we see today. And so in particular, as a straw man, one can ask, how come it doesn't require many more steps? Okay, so what this says is that the human genome is about 3 billion base pairs, and roughly there are that many different possible genomes of the length of the human genome. And so the question is, what does evolution do? So the most naive idea is that evolution is some search process, and then you randomly try lots of genomes, and if you find the human genome, yes, you declare victory. Okay, so not many people believe this was the actual process, but the question is then, you suggest a better process, and so no one has come up with a process which is clearly much more efficient than this, because most processes, search processes, optimization processes, take a long time, and so this is exponential time. So the question is to come up with if you don't like this theory, come up with a better one. That's the and so in slightly more computational terms, so the DNA describes a big circuit, a protein circuit, very complicated interacting, many interacting parts, and its description is this few billion. And so how can some complex interacting functioning mechanism evolve, say by Darwinian principles in less time? And of course, the issue is that Darwin wasn't very specific on what the mechanism is. And there are still lots of possibilities. So just saying it's some sort of random variation is a very vague statement. For example, it could literally mean that in the genome, each base pair can flip with the same probability from one generation to the other. So that's one theory, but now we know thousands of other randomized mechanisms which could equally be the mechanism that works. And whichever theory you support, you have to explain why it works. And of course, even if you can't explain how it works, you can at least simulate it. And so in fact, as soon as computers were invented, one of the first uses was people trying to simulate genetic processes, including here at the IAS. And after 60 years, at least seems that the simulation of evolution of complex mechanisms, of complex functions, which would be reminiscent of life, at least seems to have been disappointing. So these genetic algorithms do many things, but they're not very good at this. So, so we don't really have a great candidate for what exactly the evolution mechanism is, which is efficient enough. And that's basically, I'm suggesting how this question should be explored. And just, I'll rephrase this in one or two other ways. So the idea that there's a question here, some people need to be persuaded about. So clearly, so Darwin's theory of evolution, that we're all related, the evidence for it is, accumulating massively. It's an incredibly successful predictive theory from the fossil record and the DNA. So how can you have any kind of but? But I think the nature of the but is that in these 150 years, our standards of what an explanation is have also gone up. So things which were persuasive 150 years ago aren't so persuasive now. So in particular, we have a good idea of what a mechanism is. So Darwin had a mechanism. That was the novelty, that he had the mechanism for explaining evolution. So now we're pretty strict about what mechanisms are. We understand what they are. But also that we want we want to analyze the predicted behavior of mechanisms quantitatively. So we can analyze it or we can simulate it. But we've got, standards have gone up. So we reject ideas which the Victorians may not have. So put it even more strongly, so there's quotation in a slightly different context of Knuth, who said that science is what we can explain to a computer. So idea is that if you believe you're doing science, then you should be able to explain it to your computer so your computer can make predictions. So now, of course, this is an extremely harsh criterion for biology because predicting what a cell will do in response to a drug is not something one can do by simulation at the present time. So knowledge. So we may have knowledge which isn't precise enough or complete enough to satisfy this kind of requirement, but still somehow this genie is out of the bottle. So biology has to somehow respond to this challenge. Okay, so what did Darwin say? So Darwin said that we're all related. So the only diagram in his book was a family tree. This is an early version from a notebook. So the fact that biology has followed a tree, no one disputes. But what we need is an explanation of kind of at what rate you can progress along the tree. So how different are different nodes of the tree? How many million or billion years do you need to go from one to the other? Because we know that there were enormous differences between the start and what we have today. And so this quantitative issue, I just want to emphasize for last time, was very alive in Darwin's mind and in his day. So in his era, there was a strong, of course, a creationist view. And so William Paley was a religious philosopher. He was also a mathematician, or had a degree in mathematics, who articulated the creationist viewpoint, which, so one quotation from his book is that contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism, so that things which occur in biology are far more complex than anything people could make at the time. And so Darwin read this in his youth. He was totally persuaded. He liked Paley. He wrote things like that reading Paley was like, gave him as much pleasure as reading Euclid. And then even more, and he says, I didn't at the time trouble myself about Paley's premises. Taking these on trust, I was charmed and convinced of the long line of argumentation. So it's only when he traveled around the world, saw lots of animals, that he changed his mind. And so roughly, I think where we are is very much where Darwin was. So we now know that Paley's conclusion was wrong. Okay, so concluding that evolution didn't happen, that was wrong. But I think we're still having difficulty in isolating the fallacy in Paley's argument. Okay, so I think that this is the question. So we want to understand how evolution was possible, even if we don't dispute that it actually happened. So they actually went to the same college in Cambridge and are happily facing each other on a wall. So they've made peace with each other, at least. So now I want to just move on. So it's been said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So taking evolution as the primary example in biology, I think, is okay. And furthermore, evolution has this history that was always phrased as a quantitative problem. Okay. So besides computation, clearly the other new information we have, which Darwin didn't, is information about DNA. And so we now know that the human genome specifies about 20,000 proteins. And for each protein is produced according to some function. Okay, so in your DNA, there's some description, say for the 7th protein, of how much of this protein to produce in terms of the concentrations of all the other 20,000 proteins, and possibly other chemicals, nutrients or whatever. Okay, so so what your DNA specifies a kind of function specifies many functions which all interact. It tells you how much protein to express in terms of the other proteins. It's a kind of a protein machine. So the main point is that the genome actually is a function. It does something. It transforms something. It's not just a description of how tall you are. Okay, it's a function. Okay, so in pictures, so in a gene, you have a description of the protein, and you also have a description of the function, of the rule by which governs how much of the protein is going to be expressed. And we have about 20,000 of these, and it's about 4 billion bits in your DNA. So the central question is, how are these proteins and the functional and their regulation, how do they get updated by a Darwinian mechanism? So what I'm saying here is that the question of at what level evolution happens, isn't much under debate. I mean, this is the level at which evolution happens. Our genomes change the description of the proteins and also the way each one is regulated. Okay, so it's clear what changes. So we have mutations and other changes to the DNA between generations, and these change the description of the proteins and the functional conditions under which they're expressed. So kind of, so now we know the level at which evolution happens, which 150 years ago people had no idea about. So the genome acts. Okay, so it's important that it actually does something, expresses proteins, it does computes functions, and what Darwin tells us is that survival depends on what it does. Okay, so there are better things to do and worse things to do, and so the central puzzle, just repeating, is that your DNA is about 4 billion bits long, and it's arisen in the course of about 4 billion years. It's just a coincidence. But the question we have to answer is how come it wasn't exponential in the 4 billion? Because a generic search procedure would take that long. So we need some explanation of evolution which is polynomial, like linear in the 4 billion or quadratic maybe in the 4 billion, but not exponential in the 4 billion. Okay. So what we need is a computational complexity of Darwinian evolution, and the basic subject under study is these expression levels of proteins. So let's assume that the proteins are fixed, and just the expression levels change. So this is the 7th protein, and supposing it's how much is being produced in your cell depends on the concentrations of the first and second proteins. And it's some function. It's a mathematical function, and it could be this function. Okay? And so the question is, can highly complex such functions evolve into existence by Darwinian means, which means without a designer. Under a Darwinian process. So what the rest of the talk is about is to persuade you that this fits very well into an established field of computer science, which is machine learning. So how do complex functioning mechanisms arise without someone designing them, but through experience, is exactly what the field of machine learning studies. So in machine learning, you try to make systems which do something useful, but instead of putting all the information in by someone programming it, most of the information comes from some sort of experience. So briefly, I describe machine learning. So there's always there's a function to be computed. So it may be a function which translates a French sentence to an English sentence, which converts a sound to text. It tries to recognize your speech, or maybe distinguishes two species of flower. And so machine learning, you require knowledge to do it, not by being programmed, but from experience, such as from examples. Okay, so this is a field. There's a theory of this field, and now there's also large engineering practice. So your portable wireless devices do a lot of this in recognizing your wishes and your voice and everything else and translating languages. So this technology is everywhere around us, so it's very easy to talk about, whereas say 20 years ago it was kind of a pie in the sky and some strange theory. But it's something which practical realization of machine learning give you a powerful object lesson that it is possible to acquire knowledge and to improve performance without someone actually programming you. And I think that's very important as far as evolution. Okay, so a 2-minute description of machine learning for those who haven't seen it. So let's suppose we're trying to distinguish two kinds of flowers and two species of flowers, and each flower will have 3 measurements of maybe the length of the petal, the width of the petal, and the length of the stem. You get 3 numbers. And we get a list of examples, and some will list as species A and some will list as species B. So for the algorithm I'll describe, which is the perceptron algorithm, it's a classical algorithm, you need to assume that the world has some simplicity, and what you need to assume that there's some linear inequality in terms of your 3 measurements, which will predict whether it's species A or species B. So if 3 times the first parameter plus 4 times the second minus 7 times the third is greater than 0, you say species A. So in fact, if this is the truth, then the first example contradicts it, because 3 plus 4 minus 14 is not greater than 0. Okay. So what the algorithm does is that it always entertains a hypothesis. Each time it sees an example, it looks at it, sees whether it agrees with it. If it agrees with it, it doesn't change its mind. But if it doesn't, it changes its mind. And the rule is very simple. So if the first example is a positive example of species A, and it doesn't satisfy the hypothesis, they just add the coefficients 1, 1, and 2 to the coefficients of the linear function, 3, 4, and 7, minus 7 to get 4, 5, and minus 5. So you revise your hypothesis on the basis of each example. Okay, and so depending on whether it's a false positive or false negative, you update it in opposite ways. If it satisfies the example, you do nothing. And okay, and so there are various theorems which show that this has some good properties. If you do it for large data sets, what you want is to be able to predict new examples. If someone gives you a new example with the numbers 3, 5, and 2, you want to predict which species it is. So that's an algorithm, but we also need some specification of what exactly we mean by learning. So I'll give you a notion which is called probably approximately correct learning. So the idea is that the blue is the possible space of examples, like dimensions of flowers. Some are true positives, some are true negatives. And so inevitably, if you've got a hypothesis, in a complicated enough world, it won't always be correct. It'll make some mistakes on some examples. And so the question is, what exactly do you want to achieve? So briefly, you can write down a definition of what you want to achieve, which roughly says that you want the error to be small, probability error to be small. You want to make minimal assumptions about the world, that you want the distribution of the frequency with which different kinds of flowers can occur to be arbitrary. You don't want to make assumptions about the world which may not be true, so you want it to be general. And the main thing is a quantitative constraint, that the effort you make in finding your hypotheses, updating them, is limited, polynomial bounds, so it's some constant power of the parameters, like the number of variables, and also that the errors are under control. So if you want to tolerate 1% error, the amount of effort, that should be achievable, and furthermore, the amount of effort you need to put into it should be just a constant power of the 100 and not exponential in the 100. And the point of these constraints is that if you satisfy them, then it's a sensible view of learning, but also that they're not too strong, that many natural learning algorithms do satisfy them. Okay, so if you run the perceptron algorithm, you can show that in some sense it is it will predict future examples correctly, and you'll converge fast. Okay, so the correspondence with evolution, which I have in mind, is the following, because if I describe to you a perception algorithm, it doesn't correspond to people's notion of evolution. It looks something very different. But the correspondence I'm suggesting is that simply the hypothesis will be the genome, the examples will be experiences. For example, experiences in the cell would mean that you get in different times, you've got different concentrations of proteins, and what you did may be good or bad for you, and there are your experiences. So the learning algorithm, the updates are basically the mechanism of variation. So this issue of in the next generation, do you flip each base pair randomly, or is it some more complex process? And then the last thing is in this kind of machine learning, someone gives you labeling. So is this really species A or species B? And in evolution, so what's the feedback? And no one tells you whether you're doing the right thing. So feedback is just survival. Okay, so at the more human action level, we drink different amounts of coffee, we drink different amounts of wine, and different amounts of beer. And for each thing, there may be some optimal consumption level, maybe in combination. We don't know what the optimal consumption level is. We just don't know, but it's there, okay? And we're told by survival or not. Okay, so no one knows these functions, but it's still there. Okay, so the next question is, so the reasons why this doesn't look like evolution is that, well, there are several reasons. So the main one is that in some sense, this already is much stronger than what evolution does, because what it says is that on a single example, you can change the genome. So if this was the algorithm of evolution, that would say that if you want to change your genome to do something else, you could just go in there and change your genome so your children would have a better genome. Okay, so Darwin says that doesn't happen. What really happens is that we have a genome, and then there's a potential for variants of it in our children, and some hopefully are better, some may be worse. So this is the way in which we generate new hypotheses. So this Darwinian method, we're brought up to believe may have the same end result, that we optimize something, but does it? And this is a quantitative question, which is the substance of what we want to explore. Okay, so basic machine learning is very Lamarckian. From a single example, you can do something very aggressive and just change your genome. In Darwinian evolution, things are more restricted. So now I'll tell you informally how one puts together a definition of learning, of what you want to achieve in evolution, a bit like there's a definition of what you want to achieve in learning. And the basic components are what I just said, that the feedback from the environment should be independent of experience. Okay, so it's a kind of a Darwinian constraint on machine learning. It's machine learning algorithms where you somehow make variants of your current hypothesis independent of the examples, then you test them on examples to see which was the best one. So it's a Darwinian machine learning. So the other main issue which needs a bit of a discussion is that, so what's the goal of evolution? So people don't like the idea that evolution has a goal or a purpose or a target. But in this view, it doesn't have a goal, but it does have a target, and the target is just better behavior. And Darwin already tells us this, that depending on how much of different drinks you drink or how much your different genes express, some are better and some are worse, and your survival depends on how good your performance is. So ideal behavior, like the ideal amount of different drinks to have, is the target. No one knows this, and this isn't written down anywhere. No one knows this, no one needs to know it, but that's the feedback, because the people who drink the better things in the right amounts will survive and their descendants will prosper. Okay, so in this sense, one can make an analogy with machine learning where one isn't really making any more assumptions. So I think the second bullet, I don't think there are any assumptions there beyond what Darwin already tells us. Okay, so the third point is that the main question of what the algorithm is that there's such a variation, and we want to explore new ideas, so we allow any kind of randomized process, not just individual uniform variation. It turns out that even given this, evolution doesn't become trivial. It's hard to make evolution very powerful. And the fourth thing is to make everything honest. So the population sizes, the numbers of generations, the number of experiences, you have to assume to be realistic numbers. You can't assume that they're infinite, you can't assume they're exponential. So you want to work with numbers which are realistic numbers. So in the end, the goal is to get a story on what's really going on in evolution at the level of your genome with actual numbers. We don't want asymptotics. We want a plausible story of how with these many genes and this number and that number, what's been going on. And that's still difficult. Okay, so just maybe re-emphasizing what the model is. So what's going on, supposing each column is a protein, and 0 or 1 means whether it's being expressed or whether it's somewhere is in your genome. So what a single gene should do depends on some condition on this very complex mix of chemicals. And presumably it's some simple function. And so in this example, the important proteins are the blue ones, and it may be best for you to do one thing if the number of ones in that set of 3 is odd, and if it's even, it may be best to do the other thing. So these functions which control how much you're expressing of a protein depend on the conditions. You should express more under one condition and less under a different condition. And the problem is that in evolution, you're trying to discover these functions. Okay, so this is the parity function. You're looking for whether an odd or even number of proteins in a hidden subset are being expressed. And the task show that this takes exponential time. If you're trying to discover this information just from general machine learning, Lamarckian, then one can do this. Okay. So just repeating that. So the function class from which your proteins expressions are chosen from must be something. And there must be something simple because you have to explain how they can navigate, how evolution can navigate it. One simple possibility is that they're just Boolean disjunctions. So there's a hidden subset, x1, x3, and x7. You don't know. And if at least one of them is expressed, then you should do something. Another similar function class is disparity. I just mentioned, again, there's a hidden subset, and if it's an odd number, you should do something. And although mathematically these are very similar, one can show that as far as evolution algorithms, they're different. So the first one you can do, and the second one you provably can't. So of course you could say that this parity function is somewhat artificial for biology, and yes, of course, but that's kind of a prediction of the theory, that if biology was doing this all the time, then that would contradict the theory. So just to give us slightly more meat to this, so what's going on is that we have some ideal behavior, so we don't know what it is. So this function, it may describe how much you should drink of various drinks, or it may describe an optimal expression level of a protein. You have experiences, so you have examples of situations every day for your genes, or for your cells, or for your behavior. So if F is this ideal behavior, H is what your current genome does, and somehow you're judged on how far away you are from your ideal behavior. And so there's a notion of performance, which is a measure of how far you're away from your ideal behavior, and evolution tries to go from low performance to high performance. So performance corresponds to the notion of fitness, but it's a definition of fitness in terms of what's actually going on. So if you want a cartoon version, so there's a traditional statistical view of evolution where fitness is ascribed to a gene or a combination of genes, and you study how they compete. So if different things compete and mix, you predict with what success. Okay, but this computational view gives a more detailed theory in that it explains where fitness comes from. Okay, fitness. Okay, and it says the fitness is a function of the functions of your behavior H, and the ideal behavior F, and the difference between them. And once you have a definition of what performance is, then you can start asking what the algorithms should be to evolve, to go from one hypothesis to another to get better performance. And this basically is what we're studying. Okay. Okay. So not sure. Okay. So there are various technical results which I'll just hint at. So as with learning, you really want algorithms to be very robust to different worlds. So you don't want it to depend on distributions in the world, because that's very artificial. So it turns out that if the feedback from the world is just Boolean, that everything you either express a protein or you don't express a protein, then that kind of evolution seems restricted. But if you go to feedback which is more real valued, so it's not that it's optimal to drink 2 cups of coffee, but if you drink 20, then you're penalized by some function of the difference, and it may be the square, it may be cube, but we don't know. So if you've got real valued penalties to behaving badly, then that gives you more information back, and you can explain more. So the information from there. Now, of course, these expression functions, we're exploring through computation. We're asking what expression functions are possible to navigate by any computational process, but we have some information about what they are because they're just chemical processes. Okay, there's a lot of information about chemical kinetics, the rate of chemical reactions, and so under some assumptions of equilibrium, et cetera, the idea that these H's and F's are some sort of polynomial expressions is kind of natural. And then the other issues which come from machine learning, which fit in well with the biology, is this notion of attribute-efficient learning, which is that although potentially how much you should express of a protein could depend on your 20,000 other proteins, in reality, it actually depends on a small number, 7, say. Of course, no one knows which 7 it is. That's the hard problem. And you can evolve from one set of 7 to another. So exploring algorithms which are even more restricted to work with, which don't pay a high price for the 20,000, but work in terms of the number of important ones, which you don't know what they are, but you may have a bound on it. So that's important as well. Okay, so I'm not sure. So how much? Sorry? Oh, okay. So 5 quick remarks. So evolution is a very broad topic, and what I'm describing is machine learning approach to it doesn't address everything. There are thousands of interesting phenomena. So the main issue addressing is this very basic one is how can evolution achieve novel functionality as fast as it can? So life has many, so as scientists we want to do novel things, but we also do other things like eat and breathe and sleep. And so biology has the same problem, that there are lots of things going on besides just creating novel functionality. So many of the phenomena in evolution are to do with those. But what this approach tries to isolate is this idea of how you can explain achieving new functionality with limited resources. And this is what I'm saying is very computational. But having said that, I'll just quickly mention that there are various issues which are well explored by biologists which are related. So one thing is the Baldwin Effect. So since the time of Darwin, people have worried about this, that we don't really understand evolution that well. We need to find some magic which makes it faster than it seems. So the Baldwin Effect is basically the interaction of adaptation during life with evolution. If you move an animal from one environment to a hotter environment, the animal will evolve to actually, genes will change. And the issue is to what extent is its adaptive capabilities important in that process. And so many biologists believe they are, but it would be interesting to try to formalize this. Okay, so epigenetics, very much discussed. The point is that between generations, we hand down more than just a DNA sequence. There's other stuff. There's other atoms labeling our DNA, which give information down a few generations. So starvation influences our grandchildren in bacteria. Bacteria give information to their offspring about what nutrients are around. So it's an important topic of research, but no one knows whether this has a game-changing effect on evolution. Does it really change Darwin evolution? So another approach, another kind of approach is to say that maybe evolution isn't as hard as it looks. Somehow evolution is solving easier problems. And so one comment is that there are some very fast evolutionary processes like animals changing size or beak size in a few generations. And often these correspond to just very easy changes like one or two base pairs. So evolution always seems to be ready to make changes fast in a few kind of pre-rehearsed directions. But again, it's not quite clear how this changes the picture. So is this whole enterprise premature? One could say that trying to understand evolution at this level is just premature. And the reason is that how the gene corresponds to phenotype, what you are, and how it relates to the environment, we just don't understand. So how on earth can we have a theory which addresses this if we just don't understand the specifics? But then this is the main point, that machine learning is magic, okay, because it does the same thing. So with machine learning, you can produce efficient mechanisms without understanding or knowing about what you're doing. Okay, so it's amazing. Okay, so you can have a language translation system where, say from English to French, where most of the knowledge is just put in as examples, and the number of bits of information put in, which is programmed, is a much smaller fraction. So evolution seems like machine learning in that there's a mechanism for it which isn't an expert on the realities. So Darwin's evolutionary mechanism, whatever it is probably not an expert on physics or biology or ecology. It's some very generic mechanism. And put that a different way, as we've been saying this morning, so one important aspect of Turing and computation is that it describes natural processes. But a complementary observation is that, in some sense, Darwin already looked forward to this, because his mechanism is almost an archetypal mechanism of what computer scientists look at. So it's a generic mechanism which is abstract. It doesn't have knowledge. It isn't particular to the domain it's working in, but it achieves some good result for some reason which you can understand in terms of itself as a computation. Okay, so.